The old man's hands trembled as he carved the final symbol into the clay tablet. Outside his shelter, the wind had stopped. Everything had stopped. The birds, the insects, even the distant rumble of the river. All of it gone. Just silence. The kind of silence that makes your ears ring. He had been alive for 62 summers. He had seen droughts. He had seen floods. He had seen wars that left the fields red and empty. But he had never seen the sky do what it was doing now. It started 3 days ago. A new star appeared in the eastern sky, brighter than anything he had ever witnessed. Brighter than the moon. The priests said it was an omen. The children said it was beautiful. His wife said nothing. She just packed dried fish and grain into clay jars, her face tight with the kind of fear that needs no words. By the second day, the star had grown. It wasn't moving like the wandering stars that his grandfather had taught him to track. This one was getting closer, and with it came the heat. Crops withered in a single afternoon. Wells that had never run dry suddenly gave up nothing but dust. Animals fled the grasslands, streaming past the city walls in panicked herds, deer, wild cattle, even the great tusked beasts that usually feared nothing. That was yesterday. Today, the silence. He pressed the reed stylus harder into the wet clay, forming the ancient symbols his grandfather had taught him. Symbols older than his city, older than memory. He did not know what all of them meant anymore. His people had been using them for so long that some of the meanings had been lost. But he knew these symbols mattered. Someone had to remember. Someone had to write down what was about to happen. The first sound was distant thunder, but it came from below, not above. The ground trembled. Dust fell from the ceiling beams. His wife grabbed his arm, her eyes wide. Through the doorway, he could see his neighbors emerging from their homes, looking at each other with the same question on every face. Then the sky cracked. Not metaphorically, not poetically. The sky actually split open, with a sound like 1,000 trees breaking at once. Light poured through white, searing, impossible light. The new star wasn't a star at all. It was breaking apart, fragmenting into dozens of burning pieces that streaked across the heavens, trailing smoke and fire. He grabbed the tablet and pulled his wife toward the doorway. He had to see this. If these were his last moments, he would face them with his eyes open. The first fragment hit somewhere beyond the mountains to the north. The flash was so bright, it turned night into day for 3 heartbeats. Then came the shockwave, a wall of sound and wind that knocked him off his feet and shattered every clay pot in his home. But that was just the beginning. The real cataclysm started when the fragments hit the ice. The great ice fields that covered the northern world, the frozen lands that went on forever, the glaciers that had been there since before his grandfather's grandfather's grandfather, they shattered like dropped pottery. And when billions upon billions of tons of ice suddenly melt in a matter of hours, that water has to go somewhere. It goes everywhere. He carved faster now, his hands shaking, trying to capture what he was seeing, trying to leave something behind, because he could hear it coming, a sound like nothing that should exist in the natural world, a sound like the earth itself screaming. The water was coming, and with it, the end of everything he had ever known. But not the end of the story, because 12,000 years later, we would find his tablet. We would find hundreds of them, and we would have to ask ourselves a question that changes everything. What if they were telling the truth? My name is Mr. H, and tonight we're going to talk about something that should be impossible. 219 cultures. That's how many distinct civilizations around the world have a flood myth. Not a little flood, not a river overflowing its banks during the rainy season. A flood that covered the entire world. A flood that destroyed everything. A flood that only a handful of people survived. 219 completely separate cultures, spread across every continent, separated by oceans and mountains and thousands of miles, with no contact between them, no way to share stories or compare notes, and they all remember the same event. The Mesopotamians called the survivor Utnapishtim. The Hebrews called him Noah. The Hindus called him Manu. The Greeks had Deucalion. The Chinese had Gunyu. The Mayans had Tepe. The Aztecs had Coxcoxtli. Native American tribes from the Pacific Northwest to the Amazon basin all have their versions. Australian Aboriginal people have theirs. Pacific Islanders. African tribes, ancient Egyptians, every single one of them describes the same thing. A warning from the gods. A great boat. Animals saved in pairs. The entire world drowned beneath rising waters. Survivors landing on a mountaintop when the waters finally receded. And the world starting over again from almost nothing. Now, mainstream archaeology will tell you this is just coincidence. They'll say that ancient people lived near rivers. Rivers flood, so naturally every culture developed flood stories. They're just exaggerated memories of local disasters, blown out of proportion over generations of retelling. But here's the problem with that explanation. These stories are too specific, too consistent, and too impossible to dismiss as simple coincidence. Let me give you an example. The Mesopotamian flood story, the Epic of Gilgamesh, describes a flood survivor named Utnapishtim, who was warned by the god Ea to build a massive boat. The dimensions are given precisely. It's to be cube-shaped, with specific measurements. He's told to bring aboard his family, craftsmen to preserve knowledge, and breeding pairs of every animal. After the flood, the boat lands on a mountain. Utnapishtim sends out birds, first a dove, then a swallow, then a raven to find dry land. Now compare that to the biblical story of Noah. Same warning from a divine source, same boat with specific dimensions, though different measurements, same instruction to bring family and animals, same landing on a mountain after the flood, same sending out of birds in the same order, dove, then raven to find land. These texts were written by cultures separated by thousands of years and hundreds of miles, but they're describing the exact same sequence of events. Or look at the Hindu version. In the Matsya Purana, a man named Manu is warned by a fish, an avatar of the god Vishnu, about an impending flood that will destroy all life. He's told to build a boat and save seeds of all plants and pairs of all animals. The flood comes, covers the entire earth, and Manu's boat is tied to the fish and guided to a mountaintop in the Himalayas. Same warning, same boat, same animals, same mountain landing. The Greek version has Deucalion warned by his father Prometheus that Zeus is going to flood the earth to destroy humanity. Deucalion builds a chest, essentially a boat, and survives with his wife Pyrrha. After 9 days, they land on Mount Parnassus. The pattern doesn't stop. The Chaldean account, older than the biblical version, describes a man named Xisuthros who builds a boat 5 stadia long and 2 stadia wide after being warned by the god Kronos. He brings aboard his family, friends, and animals. After the flood, he sends out birds 3 times before finding land. In China, the Yao people have a legend about a catastrophic flood that covered the mountains and threatened to reach heaven itself. A man named Gun tried to stop it and failed. His son Yu succeeded in controlling the waters and became a legendary emperor. Among the Hopi people of North America, the previous world was destroyed by water when people became corrupt. A select few were saved and emerged into this current world through a hollow reed. The Maori of New Zealand tell of a man named Tawaki whose enemies caused a flood by attacking rain gods. Only Tawaki and a few others survived on mountaintops. The Incas spoke of a flood that rose above the highest mountains, killing all humans except a few who escaped in a cave. Are we really supposed to believe that all of these cultures, independently, without any contact, just happened to make up the exact same story? That they all coincidentally decided their ancestral catastrophe should involve water specifically? That they all independently came up with the detail about saving animals in a boat? That they all randomly chose mountaintop landings as their survival location? Or is there a simpler explanation? What if they're all describing the same event because it actually happened? What if, roughly 12,000 years ago, something catastrophic occurred that nearly wiped out humanity? What if our species genuinely came within a hair's breadth of extinction? And what if the handful of survivors spread across the globe, each group preserving the memory of that terrible night in their own way? Tonight, we're going to explore that possibility. If you're watching this late at night, let this mystery guide you to rest. Subscribe to the channel and settle in, because we're about to question everything you were taught about human history. The mainstream timeline says civilization began about 6,000 years ago in Mesopotamia. Before that, we were just primitive hunter-gatherers who suddenly, inexplicably, figured out agriculture, architecture, mathematics, astronomy, and writing all at once. But what if that timeline is wrong? What if civilization didn't begin 6,000 years ago? What if it began again? In 1994, a German archaeologist named Klaus Schmidt was surveying sites in southeastern Turkey when a local farmer told him about a place the locals called Gobekli Tepe, which translates to Potbelly Hill. The farmer said there were strange stones up there, old stones. Schmidt decided to take a look. What he found should not exist. Gobekli Tepe is a megalithic site consisting of massive T-shaped limestone pillars arranged in circles. Some of these pillars weigh up to 20 tons. They're carved with intricate reliefs of animals, foxes, scorpions, snakes, wild boars, vultures, lions. The carving quality is extraordinary. This isn't primitive scratchings. This is sophisticated artistic work, showing a deep understanding of anatomy and proportion. Now here's where it gets interesting. Mainstream archaeology tells us that 11,000 years ago, humans were simple hunter-gatherers. We were nomadic. We barely had tools. We didn't build anything permanent. We didn't have social organization complex enough to coordinate large construction projects. We were, according to the standard model, basically waiting around for agriculture to be invented so we could finally start becoming civilized. But Gobekli Tepe was built 11,600 years ago. That's not a guess. That's based on organic materials found at the site and radiocarbon dated multiple times by multiple labs. The site is definitively older than Stonehenge by 6,000 years. It's older than the pyramids by 7,000 years. It predates pottery. It predates writing. It predates metallurgy. It predates agriculture. Let me say that again. The people who built Gobekli Tepe had not yet invented farming. According to everything we thought we knew about human development, they should have been scattered bands of hunters following game animals and gathering wild plants. Instead, they somehow organized themselves to quarry 20-ton limestone blocks, transport them to a hilltop, carve them with sophisticated artwork, and erect them in astronomically aligned circular structures, and then they buried it, on purpose, intentionally. Someone took the time to fill in the entire site with thousands of tons of debris and soil, preserving it perfectly for 11,000 years. Why would you build something that extraordinary and then bury it? Unless you were trying to preserve something, unless you knew catastrophe was coming and wanted to leave a message for whoever came after. One pillar at Gobekli Tepe has become particularly controversial. Pillar 43, also called the vulture stone. It's covered in carved symbols and animals. At first, archaeologists assumed these were just decorative, but in 2017, researchers at the University of Edinburgh analyzed the symbols using astronomical software. The carvings appear to represent a date, a specific date. Using the positions of the animals which correspond to constellations, researchers calculated that the pillar is depicting the sky as it appeared in 10,950 BC. And it's not showing just any random night. It's showing a cataclysm, a comet impact. The symbolism is clear once you know what you're looking at. A headless man represents disaster, death, massive loss of life. The vultures and scorpions represent death and destruction. The positions of the animals align with a massive comet fragment impact that occurred exactly when the Younger Dryas period began, a period of catastrophic climate change that nearly ended humanity. Gobekli Tepe isn't just an ancient temple. It's a warning. It's a memorial to the event that destroyed the world that came before. And mainstream archaeology barely talks about it. Now let's go underwater. Off the coast of Yonaguni, Japan, there's a structure that shouldn't be there. It's a massive stone formation with straight edges, right angles, clean steps, flat platforms, and what appear to be carved roads and water channels. It sits 100 feet below the surface of the ocean. Marine geologist Masaaki Kimura has spent decades studying the Yonaguni structure. He argues it's man-made, not natural. The angles are too precise. The steps are too uniform. There are markings that appear to be symbols or writing. There are features that look exactly like architectural elements, channels for water flow, post holes for wooden structures, a carved head that resembles a human face. Geologists opposed to this interpretation say it's just natural rock formation, that sandstone can fracture in ways that look artificial. But here's the problem with that argument. If the Yonaguni structure is natural, then why are there similar underwater structures at Dwarka in India, at Kerama in Japan, off the coast of Cuba, where sonar imaging has revealed what appear to be massive stone structures, including pyramids at 2,200 feet depth? The mainstream explanation is that these are all natural formations, all of them, just coincidentally shaped like architectural structures with right angles and steps and platforms. Nothing to see here. Move along. But let's do some math. Sea levels were significantly lower during the last ice age. How much lower? About 400 feet. That means any coastal civilization that existed more than 12,000 years ago would now be underwater. Their cities would be submerged beneath hundreds of feet of ocean. We've explored less than 5% of the ocean floor. Less than 5%. We've mapped the surface of Mars in more detail than we've mapped our own ocean bottoms. And in that tiny fraction we have explored, we keep finding structures that look artificial. Structures at depths that suggest they were built when sea levels were much lower, which means they'd have to be at least 10,000 to 12,000 years old. The depth of the Yonaguni structure suggests it went underwater around 10,000 years ago. The Cuban underwater formations, based on their depth, would have to have been above water at least 12,000 years ago, possibly much earlier. But we're told that's impossible because humans 12,000 years ago didn't build cities. They were hunter-gatherers, primitives. They didn't have the knowledge, the organization, or the technology, except they did build Gobekli Tepe. So clearly, they had knowledge and organization and technology that the standard timeline doesn't account for. Now let's talk about something even stranger. Maps. In 1513, a Turkish admiral named Piri Reis compiled a world map. He didn't claim to have explored these regions himself. He said he based his map on older source maps, some dating back to the time of Alexander the Great and even earlier. The Piri Reis map shows the Atlantic Ocean, the coast of South America, and something that shouldn't be there, the northern coast of Antarctica. Without ice, Antarctica has been covered in ice for millions of years. The ice sheet is over a mile thick in most places. You cannot see the coastline of Antarctica today without ground-penetrating radar. The actual rocky coast beneath the ice wasn't mapped accurately until 1949, when a Swedish-British expedition used echo-sounding equipment to map the subglacial terrain. Yet the Piri Reis map from 1513 shows Antarctica's coast with remarkable accuracy, and it shows it ice-free. The only way that map could exist is if it was copied from source maps created when Antarctica didn't have ice, which would mean those source maps had to be at least 6,000 years old, possibly much older, which means someone was doing sophisticated maritime exploration and cartography thousands of years before we supposedly invented those things. And Piri Reis isn't the only one. The Orontius Phineus map from 1531 also shows Antarctica, also ice-free, with mountain ranges and rivers in positions that match the actual subglacial topography that we didn't discover until the 20th century. The Boache map from 1737 shows Antarctica as two separate land masses, connected by a narrow strip of land, which is exactly what Antarctica would look like without ice, something we only confirmed in the 1950s. How did these map makers have access to information about Antarctica's ice-free coastline? The standard explanation is that these are just lucky guesses, mistakes, or misinterpretations of other lands. But that explanation falls apart when you realize the accuracy involved. These aren't vague approximations. They're showing specific geographic features that match reality. The mathematics required to create these maps is sophisticated. To accurately map coastlines, you need spherical trigonometry. You need to understand longitude and latitude. You need instruments precise enough to measure angles and distances across thousands of miles of ocean. According to the mainstream timeline, these mathematical concepts weren't fully developed until the European Renaissance. Yet here are maps compiled in the 1500s claiming to be based on much, much older sources that display this exact knowledge. Who made the original maps? Who had the ships, the instruments, the mathematical knowledge, and the need to explore and chart the entire world, including Antarctica? Not in the 1500s, but thousands of years earlier, before whatever cataclysm buried that knowledge, until bits and pieces started resurfacing in medieval libraries. Now let's look at something that makes all of this even more disturbing. Your DNA. Geneticists studying human population history have discovered something called a genetic bottleneck. This is when a species' population drops so dramatically that it leaves a permanent mark in the genetic code of all descendants. There's less genetic diversity, because everyone alive descended from that tiny surviving population. Humans went through a bottleneck approximately 70,000 years ago. That's the Tepe catastrophe theory, a supervolcano eruption that nearly ended our species. That one's accepted by mainstream science. But there's evidence of another bottleneck, a more recent one, right around 12,000 years ago. Mitochondrial DNA analysis, DNA passed down through the maternal line, shows that all modern humans can trace their ancestry back to a remarkably small population of women who lived approximately 12,000 years ago. The same is true for Y chromosome DNA, passed down through the paternal line. The genetic diversity suggests that human population crashed to somewhere between 10,000 and 30,000 individuals worldwide. Think about that. From potentially millions of humans spread across the globe, our population collapsed to a number that could fit inside a large sports stadium. Something happened 12,000 years ago that nearly wiped us out. And it happened exactly when the flood myths say it happened. The genetic evidence doesn't tell us what caused the bottleneck. It just tells us it occurred. But we have geological evidence of massive climate disruption starting around 12,800 years ago. We have evidence of extinction events that wiped out most megafauna species. We have impact craters and a layer of carbon-rich sediment, suggesting massive wildfires across multiple continents. We have ice cores showing rapid temperature changes. And we have 219 cultures, all remembering the same flood. The DNA doesn't lie. Our population crashed. We nearly went extinct. The survivors scattered, isolated in small pockets. Their numbers so reduced that we're still seeing the genetic effects today, 12,000 years later. So here's where we are. We have a megalithic site built by supposedly primitive people that predates civilization by thousands of years and appears to commemorate a cosmic disaster. We have underwater structures at depths suggesting they're at least 10,000 years old. We have maps showing knowledge of Antarctica's ice-free coastline, and we have genetic evidence of a near-extinction event. All of it pointing to the same time period. All of it suggesting that something happened 12,000 years ago. Something that destroyed an advanced civilization and reset humanity back to the Stone Age. But if you open a standard history textbook, none of this is in there. You won't find Gobekli Tepe's implications discussed. You won't find the underwater structures analyzed. You won't find questions raised about the source maps. You won't find the connection made between the genetic bottleneck and the flood myths. Why not? That's a question nobody wants to ask. Let's pause for a moment and consider what we've just looked at. Structures that shouldn't exist. Maps that shouldn't be possible. DNA that tells a story of mass extinction. All of it dismissed, explained away, or simply ignored by mainstream academia. And that raises an uncomfortable question. If an advanced civilization existed before the flood, where's the rest of the evidence? Where are the cities, the tools, the technology? Why are we finding hints and fragments instead of overwhelming proof? Here's the thing. If a cataclysm destroyed our civilization right now, if sea levels rose 400 feet tomorrow, what would survive? Our coastal cities would be underwater. Our technology would corrode. Our buildings would crumble. In 12,000 years, what would future archaeologists find? Maybe some stone monuments, maybe some confusing maps, maybe genetic evidence of a population collapse. Sound familiar? Maybe the evidence is scarce because catastrophes erase civilizations. That's what they do. That's the point. Where are you watching from right now? Every culture on Earth remembers this same night. Comment below and let's see how far this story has spread. Because what we're about to explore next will show you that the survivors left more behind than we realize. In 360 BC, the Greek philosopher Plato wrote two dialogues called Timaeus and Critias. In them, he describes a conversation between his teacher Socrates and an Egyptian priest. The priest tells Socrates about an island civilization that existed 9,000 years before their time, which would place it around 11,600 years ago. The civilization was called Atlantis. Now, before you dismiss this as ancient fiction, listen to what Plato actually describes. He's very specific. He doesn't describe Atlantis as a mythical paradise or a magical realm. He describes it as a real place with real geography, real politics, real technology, and real military power. Atlantis was located beyond the Pillars of Hercules, what we call the Strait of Gibraltar. It was larger than Libya and Asia Minor combined. The island had a sophisticated canal system for irrigation. They had hot and cold running water. They built with 3 different types of stone, red, white, and black, quarried directly from their island. They had a massive central city arranged in concentric rings of land and water connected by bridges and tunnels. They had ships and a powerful navy. They had metallurgy advanced enough to create an alloy Plato calls orichalcum, which he says was highly valued. And then, in a single day and night of catastrophe, the entire island sank into the ocean and disappeared. Most historians treat Atlantis as fiction, a philosophical metaphor Plato invented to make a point about hubris and the fall of civilizations. But here's what's interesting. Plato insists multiple times that this is not fiction. He specifically states that this is a true account passed down through Egyptian records. He names his sources. He provides dates. He treats it exactly like a historical record, not a parable. And the timeline he gives, roughly 11,600 years ago, matches the end of the Younger Dryas period exactly. The exact moment when sea levels rose catastrophically and the climate shifted dramatically. Now look at the Sumerian king list. This is an actual ancient document, not a philosophical dialogue. It lists every king who ruled in Sumer, along with how long they reigned. For the kings after the flood, the reign lengths are normal. 20 years, 30 years, 40 years. But for the kings before the flood, the numbers become extraordinary. One king supposedly ruled for 43,200 years, another for 36,000 years. The list clearly divides history into 2 eras, before the flood and after the flood. Before the flood, everything was different. After the flood, everything became smaller, shorter, diminished. The Hindu texts describe the same pattern. They divide cosmic history into 4 ages called yugas. The first age, the Satya Yuga or Golden Age, was a time when humans lived for thousands of years. Knowledge was perfect. There was no war, no disease, no suffering. Technology and spirituality existed in harmony. Then came decline through 3 subsequent ages, each one shorter and more degraded than the last, until we reach the current age, the Kali Yuga, the age of darkness and ignorance. The Egyptian texts speak of Tepe the first time, an age when gods walked among humans, when the Nile flowed with knowledge instead of just water, when the pyramids and temples were built by beings who understood sciences we've lost. Egyptian records insist that their civilization didn't begin with the first dynasty around 5,000 years ago. That was just when they started rebuilding. The real Egyptian civilization was far, far older. Notice the pattern. Every ancient culture has a memory of a golden age, a time before, a time when humanity was more advanced, not less, when people lived longer, when knowledge was greater, when building and creating came easily because the understanding was deeper. We're taught to dismiss these as myths, fantasies about a perfect past that never existed. But what if they're not fantasies? What if they're memories? Let's look at technology that shouldn't exist. In 1901, divers recovering artifacts from an ancient Roman shipwreck off the Greek island of Antikythera found a corroded lump of bronze. When researchers cleaned it and examined it closely, they realized they were looking at a machine, a sophisticated mechanical computer with over 30 bronze gears that meshed together in a complex system. The Antikythera mechanism, as it's now called, is an astronomical calculator. You input a date, turn the crank, and it calculates the positions of the sun, moon, and planets. It predicts eclipses. It accounts for the irregular orbit of the moon. The level of miniaturization and precision is extraordinary. Some of the gear teeth are less than a millimeter across. This device was built around 100 BC. The next time humanity built anything with this level of mechanical complexity was 1400 years later, during the European Renaissance. How did ancient Greeks build a computer? Where did they get the knowledge? The device didn't just appear out of nowhere. It represents the endpoint of a long tradition of astronomical observation, mathematical calculation, and precision engineering. But we have no record of that tradition, no prototypes, no evolution of the technology. It just appears, fully formed, impossibly sophisticated, and then disappears again for over a millennium, unless it wasn't Greek knowledge at all, unless they were copying or preserving something even older. In 1936, workers excavating near Baghdad found a clay jar containing a copper cylinder with an iron rod suspended inside it. When researchers tested it, they realized it could function as a galvanic cell, essentially, an ancient battery. Fill it with an acidic liquid like vinegar or wine, and it generates electrical current. Why would anyone in ancient Mesopotamia need a battery? We don't know. Mainstream archaeology suggests it was used for electroplating gold onto silver, though there's no proof of this. But the fact remains, someone in the ancient world understood enough about chemistry and electrical principles to build a functioning battery 1800 years before Alessandro Volta supposedly invented the first one. Now let's talk about stone cutting. At Sacsayhuaman in Peru, there are stone blocks fitted together so precisely that you cannot slide a piece of paper between them. No mortar. Just stone against stone, cut so accurately that they've held together through centuries of earthquakes, while modern buildings around them collapsed. Some of these blocks weigh over 200 tons. They have irregular, complex shapes with multiple angles, and they fit together perfectly. How did the Inca cut these stones? According to mainstream archaeology, they used harder stones to pound softer stones into shape. Okay, try it yourself. Take a rock and try to pound another rock into a precise geometric shape with angles accurate to fractions of a millimeter. Now do that with a 200-ton block. Now make it fit perfectly against other blocks with equally complex shapes. The conventional explanation doesn't work. The precision is too high. The blocks are too large. The shapes are too complex. Something else was happening here. Some technique or technology we don't understand. The same precision appears at Egyptian sites. The granite boxes in the Serapeum of Saqqara are cut so accurately that engineers using modern measuring instruments have found flatness within 2/10,000ths of an inch. The internal corners are perfectly square. This is machine-level precision. This requires sophisticated tools, not copper chisels and stone pounders. And then there's the concrete. Roman concrete structures like the Pantheon have stood for 2,000 years. The concrete gets harder over time, not weaker. Modern engineers trying to recreate Roman concrete recipes struggle to match the durability. The Romans knew something about material science that we forgot and are only now rediscovering. But Roman concrete isn't even the oldest. At Gobekli Tepe, researchers found a form of terrazzo flooring, a composite material made from lime and crushed stone that's 11,000 years old. The primitive hunter-gatherers who supposedly built Gobekli Tepe also knew advanced material science. The megalithic chambers at sites like Newgrange in Ireland have acoustic properties that seem deliberately designed. The chambers amplify certain sound frequencies. Modern researchers have found that chanting or drumming in these spaces creates resonance patterns that can induce altered states of consciousness. The builders weren't just stacking rocks, they were engineering acoustic experiences. So, we have ancient batteries, astronomical computers, precision stone cutting beyond modern capabilities, advanced concrete formulas, and acoustic engineering. All of this dismissed as primitive attempts at construction that somehow, coincidentally, achieved results we can barely replicate with modern technology. Or maybe the people who built these things weren't primitive at all. Let's talk about who preserved the knowledge. Throughout the ancient world, there were mystery schools, secret societies dedicated to preserving and transmitting knowledge. The Egyptian mystery schools at Heliopolis and Memphis, the Eleusinian mysteries in Greece, the Orphic traditions, the Mithraic cults. These weren't just religious organizations, they were educational institutions that used ritual and symbolism to encode information. Why the secrecy? Because open knowledge can be destroyed, books can be burned, teachers can be killed, but knowledge hidden in symbols, embedded in myths, preserved through initiation rituals, that knowledge survives. The Hermetic tradition, attributed to the mythical Hermes Trismegistus, is based on the principle as above, so below. This isn't poetry, it's astronomy. It's the recognition that patterns on Earth mirror patterns in the heavens, that the movement of planets correlates with cycles of human civilization, that understanding the cosmos means understanding ourselves. The ancient Sumerians had something called the Me tablets, containing fundamental knowledge of civilization. Not just practical information like how to make bread or smelt metal, but deep knowledge about the nature of reality, consciousness, and cosmic order. Whoever possessed the Me possessed the power to build or rebuild civilization. The Vedic tradition in India claims to preserve knowledge through oral transmission going back thousands of years. Scholars have tested this claim by comparing ancient Vedic texts with modern recitations and finding them virtually identical, word for word, across 3,000 years of oral preservation. The accuracy is extraordinary. These weren't casual stories told around campfires. This was deliberate, systematic knowledge preservation, using human memory as the storage medium. And it worked. The knowledge survived. The Dogon people of Mali have astronomical knowledge they shouldn't possess. They know about Sirius B, a white dwarf star invisible to the naked eye that wasn't confirmed by Western astronomy until 1962. The Dogon say this knowledge came from their ancestors, passed down through generations. When asked where their ancestors learned it, they say it came from visitors from the sky. Were there visitors? We don't know. But someone taught the Dogon about stellar astronomy long before Western science discovered it. What did the ancients actually know? They knew about the precession of the equinoxes. This is the slow wobble of Earth's axis that causes the position of stars to shift over thousands of years. A complete cycle takes 25,800 years. To notice this phenomenon, you need to keep accurate astronomical records for centuries, compare them across generations, and do complex calculations. The ancient Egyptians knew about it. The Sumerians knew about it. It's encoded in myths around the world. The Mayan calendar is more accurate than the Gregorian calendar we use today. The Mayans calculated the solar year as 365.242 days. Modern measurement puts it at 365.24219 days. They were accurate to within 17 seconds per year, without telescopes, without computers, without any of the instruments we consider essential for astronomy. Stonehenge aligns with the summer and winter solstices. The pyramids of Giza align with true north to within 1/15 of a degree. The temples of Angkor Wat in Cambodia are laid out to mirror the constellation Draco as it appeared in 10,500 BC, thousands of years before the temples were supposedly built. How did builders in different parts of the world, at different times, all align their monuments to astronomical phenomena with such precision. Either they independently developed sophisticated astronomy and geometry, or they were working from a common knowledge base that predated all of them. The Great Pyramid of Giza encodes mathematical constants. The ratio of the pyramid's perimeter to its height is 2 times pi. The structure incorporates phi, the golden ratio. The dimensions relate to the size and shape of the Earth with remarkable accuracy. You can use measurements of the pyramid to calculate the Earth's radius, its mass, and the distance to the Sun. Coincidence? In a structure with 2.3 million stone blocks placed with precision alignment, ancient metallurgy required temperatures that shouldn't have been achievable. Bronze requires heating copper and tin to temperatures above 1000 degrees Celsius. Iron smelting requires even higher temperatures. How did ancient peoples achieve this without modern furnaces? We're not entirely sure, but they did it. And not just simple smelting. They created steel. They created alloys with specific properties for specific purposes. They understood material science. Ancient surgeons performed trepanation, drilling holes in skulls with patient survival rates indicating they understood infection control, anesthesia, and basic neurology. Skulls found with healed trepanation holes show the patients lived for years afterward. This wasn't butchery. This was surgery. So, here's what we know. Before the flood, there was a civilization, or multiple civilizations with knowledge we're only now rediscovering. They had astronomy, mathematics, engineering, metallurgy, medicine, and material science. They encoded this knowledge in monuments, in myths, in mystery schools, in oral traditions. When catastrophe struck, most of it was lost, but fragments survived. The survivors weren't starting from zero. They were starting from memory. They knew there had been something greater. They tried to rebuild it. Sometimes they succeeded, sometimes they failed. But they remembered, and they tried to warn us that it could happen again. We are not the first. That's the uncomfortable truth sitting at the heart of all this evidence. We like to think of ourselves as the pinnacle of human achievement, the most advanced civilization that has ever existed, the apex of a linear progression from cavemen to smartphones. But what if we're not at the top? What if we're in the middle? What if we're the children of survivors who lost everything except stories? Every pyramid, every megalithic monument, every mystery school, every encoded myth, they're all inheritance. Pieces of something greater that our ancestors tried desperately to preserve and pass down. Sometimes they succeeded in keeping the knowledge alive. Sometimes they only managed to preserve the memory that knowledge once existed. We stand on the shoulders of forgotten giants, and if we're not careful, if we don't pay attention to what they tried to tell us, we might repeat their mistakes. Subscribe to explore more of these lost chapters with Mr. H, because the story is about to get darker. The question isn't just what they knew, it's what destroyed them. 12,800 years ago, something hit the Earth. We're not talking about a single asteroid impact like the one that killed the dinosaurs 66 million years ago. This was different. This was a fragmented comet, multiple pieces breaking apart in Earth's atmosphere and impacting across the northern hemisphere in a cascade of destruction that lasted for days, possibly weeks. The evidence is everywhere once you know what to look for. There's a layer of sediment found across North America, Europe, and Asia that dates to exactly 12,800 years ago. This layer contains high concentrations of platinum, iridium, and other rare elements that typically come from space. It contains nanodiamonds, tiny diamonds that only form under extreme temperature and pressure, like a cosmic impact. It contains carbon spherules, microscopic balls of carbon created when organic matter is instantly vaporized by intense heat. This layer also contains a substance called melt glass rock that was heated so intensely it melted and then rapidly cooled into glass. You find melt glass at nuclear test sites. You find it at meteor impact craters. And you find it in this 12,800-year-old layer spread across multiple continents. Something created temperatures hot enough to melt rock across thousands of square miles. The Carolina Bays are one of the most visible pieces of evidence. These are 500,000 oval-shaped depressions scattered across the coastal plains of the eastern United States, from New Jersey down to Florida. They're all oriented in the same direction, northwest to southeast. They're all elliptical, with raised rims. They look exactly like secondary impact craters, the kind created when a primary impact throws up massive amounts of debris that then falls back to Earth at high velocity, creating thousands of smaller impacts. For decades, geologists debated what created the Carolina Bays. Wind and water were the standard explanations. But those explanations don't account for the uniform orientation, the raised rims, or the sheer number of them. The impact theory explains all of it. Something hit the Laurentide ice sheet that covered North America, fragmenting and creating a spray pattern of secondary impacts that carved out the Carolina Bays. In Australia, there are massive fields of tektites, glassy objects formed when terrestrial rocks are melted by impact and ejected into the atmosphere, cooling and solidifying before falling back to Earth. The Australian tektite fields cover an area of millions of square kilometres. They date to approximately 12,000 years ago. The Greenland ice cores tell the same story. When researchers drill down through layers of ice, each layer represents a year of snowfall. The ice cores are like a timeline of Earth's climate, and in the ice from 12,800 years ago, there's a dramatic spike in platinum and other cosmic elements. Right at that layer, the climate record shows a sudden, catastrophic temperature drop. The Younger Dryas period begins exactly at this moment. The Younger Dryas was a period of rapid cooling that interrupted the warming trend at the end of the last ice age. Temperatures in the northern hemisphere dropped by an average of 15 degrees Fahrenheit in less than a decade. Some regions experienced drops of up to 30 degrees. Glaciers that had been retreating suddenly advanced again. The climate that had been steadily warming for thousands of years suddenly reversed course. This doesn't happen naturally. Climate doesn't shift that rapidly without a major forcing event. And we now have evidence of what that event was, a cosmic impact that triggered a cascade of catastrophic consequences. But the impacts themselves were just the beginning. When comet fragments hit the Laurentide ice sheet, a sheet of ice covering most of Canada and the northern United States, in some places over 2 miles thick, the energy released was staggering. Estimates suggest the impacts released energy equivalent to millions of nuclear weapons detonating simultaneously. That much energy hitting that much ice does two things. First, it melts an enormous volume of ice almost instantaneously. Second, it throws billions of tons of ice, rock, and water vapor into the atmosphere. The meltwater had to go somewhere, and it went everywhere. Geologists have found evidence of massive flood events across North America dating to this period. The channeled scablands of Washington state are a landscape carved by catastrophic flooding. Floods so powerful they moved house-sized boulders hundreds of miles, carved channels hundreds of feet deep through solid bedrock, and created waterfalls that would have dwarfed Niagara Falls. The volume of water involved was staggering more water than exists in all the Great Lakes combined, released in a matter of weeks. This is what geologists call a glacial lake outburst flood, or Jukulaup. When ice dams containing glacial lakes suddenly fail, the water doesn't trickle out. It explodes outward in a wall of water, traveling at highway speeds, carrying everything in its path. Now imagine not just one ice dam failing, but hundreds, thousands. Imagine the entire northern ice sheet destabilizing, fracturing, collapsing. Imagine meltwater from an area the size of the continental United States suddenly draining into the oceans. Sea levels didn't rise gradually. They spiked, rapidly, catastrophically. The geological record shows a meltwater pulse around 12,800 years ago, a sudden, dramatic rise in sea level of multiple meters within a very short time period, possibly just decades. Some estimates suggest sea level rose as much as 40 to 60 feet in less than a century. Coastal areas that had been dry land for thousands of years were suddenly underwater. If you were a coastal civilization, and most advanced civilizations tend to be coastal because of access to trade, fishing, and transportation, you would have been devastated. Your cities would have flooded. Your ports would have submerged. Your agricultural lands would have been destroyed by saltwater intrusion. And this wasn't a slow process you could adapt to. This was rapid enough that within a single generation, the world your grandparents knew would have been gone, drowned beneath the waves. But wait, it gets worse. When billions of tons of ice, rock, and water vapor get thrown into the atmosphere by cosmic impacts, they don't just fall back down. They stay suspended, blocking sunlight. The temperature drop wasn't just from the Younger Dryas cooling event. It was from impact winter, the same phenomenon that killed the dinosaurs. The sky would have darkened. Temperatures would have plunged. Growing seasons would have collapsed. Forests across the northern hemisphere show burn layers dating to this period. Not small fires, continental-scale wildfires. The cosmic impacts ignited massive conflagrations that consumed forests from North America to Europe to Asia. The smoke from these fires would have added to the atmospheric debris, further blocking sunlight. Then came the megafauna extinctions. Woolly mammoths, mastodons, giant ground sloths, saber-toothed cats, dire wolves, giant beavers, camels, horses. All of these species went extinct in North America around 12,000 years ago, not gradually over millions of years. Suddenly, within a few centuries. possibly within decades. The mammoth die-off is particularly telling. Frozen mammoth carcasses found in Siberia show signs of flash freezing. These animals didn't slowly freeze to death over a harsh winter. They froze so rapidly that their stomach contents, still fresh grass and flowers, were preserved. Some were found in standing positions, frozen mid-step. The temperature drop was sudden enough and severe enough to freeze multi-ton animals solid before their bodies could decompose. This is what the ancient myths describe. Let's go back to those flood stories with fresh eyes. The Mesopotamian account says the flood was preceded by fire falling from the sky. The Hindu version describes the sky raining fire before the waters came. Native American accounts talk about the sky changing color, the sun disappearing, and winter arriving in the middle of summer before the Great Flood. These aren't poetic embellishments. They're accurate descriptions of an impact event, followed by impact winter, followed by glacial collapse flooding. The Epic of Gilgamesh describes Utnapishtim's experience during the flood. He says the storm was so terrible that even the gods were frightened. The land shattered like a clay pot. Darkness covered everything. The flood came up so quickly and so powerfully that it reached the mountains. For 6 days and 7 nights, the storm raged. On the 7th day, the storm subsided, and Utnapishtim's boat was grounded on a mountain. The biblical account describes similar details. The fountains of the deep burst forth, which sounds like massive meltwater releases from beneath ice sheets. The windows of heaven opened, atmospheric moisture falling as torrential rain. The waters prevailed upon the earth for 150 days, before beginning to recede. Noah's Ark came to rest on the mountains of Ararat. The Hindu Matsya Purana describes a darkness that covered the world, followed by the waters rising until they covered the highest peaks. Manu's boat was guided by the fish avatar of Vishnu to the Himalayas, where he and the seeds of life waited for the waters to recede. Greek mythology describes Deucalion's flood as Zeus sending a deluge to destroy humanity because of their wickedness. But the details are instructive. Deucalion and Pyrrha floated for 9 days before landing on Mount Parnassus. When they emerged, the world was empty. All of humanity had drowned. They were the only survivors. Chinese legends describe a flood so vast that it threatened to reach heaven itself. The flood destroyed crops, homes, and entire kingdoms. It took generations to bring the waters under control and restore order to the land. The Hopi described the previous world ending in water. The people who survived did so by climbing to the highest peaks and waiting for the waters to recede before descending to rebuild. Notice the common elements: fire from the sky, rapid onset, waters covering the mountains, boats as survival mechanisms, mountain landings, small numbers of survivors, the world empty and destroyed afterward. These aren't vague myths. They're eyewitness accounts passed down through oral tradition for 12,000 years, and they match the geological and astronomical evidence with shocking accuracy. Now here's the truly terrifying part: the aftermath. After the impacts, after the floods, after the fires, the survivors faced a world transformed into a frozen hellscape. The impact winter lasted for years, possibly decades. Sunlight couldn't penetrate the dust and smoke. Temperatures remained below freezing, even in summer. Crops couldn't grow. The megafauna that humans had hunted for food were dying off en masse. The human population crashed, not just decreased, crashed, from potentially millions to thousands, maybe tens of thousands, if we're generous. Genetic evidence suggests that all modern humans descend from a breeding population of possibly as few as 10,000 individuals who lived through this period. Think about what that means. Entire civilizations were wiped out, cities drowned or abandoned, knowledge lost as the people who held it died, technologies forgotten because there was no one left to teach them, and everyone was focused on simple survival, finding food, staying warm, staying alive. The survivors who made it through had to abandon the coastlines because the coastlines were gone, drowned beneath hundreds of feet of risen sea level. They fled inland. They climbed to the mountains. They scattered to the corners of the earth, isolated from each other, each group small enough that maintaining complex civilization was impossible. They reverted to hunter-gatherer subsistence, not because they didn't know better, but because there was no alternative. You can't maintain cities when there's no food. You can't preserve knowledge institutions when you're struggling to survive from one season to the next. You can't pass down sophisticated technologies when there's no surplus resources to support specialists and teachers. But they remembered. They knew there had been something greater. They'd seen it with their own eyes, or heard about it from parents and grandparents. They knew about the cities, the monuments, the knowledge, the golden age before the sky fell and the waters rose. And they encoded that memory into stories, myths, and warnings so that when their descendants finally rebuilt enough to have writing and monuments and civilizations again, they would know what had happened. They would know it could happen again. Because here's what keeps researchers up at night. The Younger Dryas impact wasn't unique. Earth passes through debris streams from fragmenting comets on a regular cosmic schedule. The Taurid meteor stream, which Earth passes through twice a year, contains fragments large enough to cause catastrophic damage if they hit us, and we're overdue for another encounter. The ancients built their monuments and encoded their warnings for a reason. They were trying to tell us something. They were trying to say, this happened before, and it will happen again, and you need to be ready. We haven't been listening. So we've established what happened. A cosmic impact. Global catastrophe. Civilization destroyed. Humanity nearly extinct. But here's where things get uncomfortable. We have the evidence. We have the geological record. We have the ice cores. We have the myths from 219 cultures. We have the genetic bottleneck. We have monuments like Gobekli Tepe that seem designed specifically to commemorate this event. And yet, if you open a mainstream history textbook, almost none of this is in there. The Younger Dryas impact hypothesis is still considered fringe science by many academics. The idea of a pre-flood advanced civilization is dismissed as pseudo-archaeology. The connections between the myths and the geological evidence are ignored. Why? If the evidence is this compelling, why is there such resistance to investigating it? Why are certain sites not being excavated? Why are certain questions not being asked? What ancient mystery keeps you awake at night? Share your thoughts in the comments below, because what we're about to explore is perhaps the most disturbing part of this entire story. It's not just that we lost a civilization 12,000 years ago, it's that someone doesn't want us to find it. Academia operates on a system of peer review, funding, and reputation. To advance your career as an archaeologist or geologist, you need to publish papers in respected journals. To publish in respected journals, your work needs to pass peer review. And to pass peer review, your conclusions need to align with established paradigms. Challenge those paradigms, and you risk everything. This isn't conspiracy. This is institutional inertia, and it's incredibly powerful. The standard archaeological timeline states that civilization began around 6,000 years ago in Mesopotamia with the Sumerians. Before that, humans were hunter-gatherers who lived in small nomadic bands. Around 10,000 years ago, we figured out agriculture. Around 6,000 years ago, we figured out cities, writing, and complex social organization. Everything before that was primitive, simple, unsophisticated. This timeline is taught in every university. It's in every textbook. It's the foundation of how we understand human history, and it's defended fiercely by the archaeological establishment. When Gobekli Tepe was discovered and dated to 11,600 years ago, it should have shattered this timeline completely. Here was a massive megalithic site with sophisticated carving, astronomical alignments, and evidence of complex social organization built 6,000 years before civilization was supposed to exist. The response from mainstream archaeology was telling. Instead of celebrating a revolutionary discovery that expanded our understanding of human capability, many archaeologists tried to minimize its significance. They called it an anomaly, a one-off. They suggested that maybe hunter-gatherers built it during seasonal gatherings, but it didn't represent true civilization. They created elaborate explanations for how primitive people could have built it without acknowledging that maybe these people weren't primitive at all. The problem is, once you accept that Gobekli Tepe represents sophisticated pre-agricultural civilization, everything else starts to unravel. You have to reconsider the underwater structures, you have to reconsider the flood myths, you have to reconsider the genetic bottleneck, you have to reconsider everything. And that's terrifying for people who have built entire careers on the existing timeline. Let me give you a specific example. In 1990, a geologist named Robert Schoch examined the Great Sphinx of Giza. Schoch wasn't an Egyptologist. He was a geologist specializing in rock weathering and erosion. The Egyptian government invited him to settle a debate about the age of the Sphinx using geological analysis. What Schoch found shocked him. The weathering patterns on the Sphinx enclosure, the trench carved out of bedrock that the Sphinx sits in, showed clear evidence of water erosion. Not wind erosion, not sand erosion, water erosion, deep vertical channels carved by heavy rainfall flowing over the limestone for extended periods. Here's the problem. The Sphinx is located in the Sahara Desert. The last time the Giza Plateau experienced rainfall heavy enough to create this kind of erosion was at the end of the last ice age, roughly 10,000 to 12,000 years ago. The conventional dating of the Sphinx puts its construction at around 4,500 years ago, during the reign of Pharaoh Khafre in the 4th dynasty. But the geological evidence suggests the Sphinx is at least 7,000 to 9,000 years old, possibly older. Schoch published his findings. The response from Egyptology was immediate and hostile. He was attacked personally. His credentials were questioned. Other geologists who examined the site and agreed with his conclusions were also dismissed. The Egyptian Antiquities Authority stopped granting him permits to conduct further research. Why? Because if the Sphinx is older than the 4th dynasty, it means Egyptian civilization is older than we thought. Much older. It means there was advanced stone working capability in Egypt thousands of years before the first pharaohs. It means we're missing huge chunks of history. And rather than investigate this possibility, the establishment chose to attack the messenger, or consider Graham Hancock. Hancock is a journalist and researcher who has spent decades investigating evidence of advanced pre-Ice Age civilizations. He's written extensively about underwater structures, ancient maps, astronomical alignments in megalithic sites, and the connections between flood myths and geological evidence. Mainstream archaeologists dismiss Hancock as a pseudoscientist. They refuse to engage with his evidence. Academic journals won't publish rebuttals to his work because acknowledging it would give it legitimacy. When Netflix released a documentary series featuring Hancock's research, the Society for American Archaeology released an official statement condemning it and calling for content warnings about misinformation. But here's what's interesting. The archaeologists criticizing Hancock don't actually address his evidence. They don't explain the underwater structures at depths suggesting they're 10,000 years old. They don't explain how Piri Reis had accurate maps of Antarctica's ice-free coastline. They don't explain Gobekli Tepe, or the genetic bottleneck, or the platinum spike in ice cores from 12,800 years ago. They just say he's wrong. They say he's not a credentialed archaeologist, therefore his research doesn't count. They attack his credentials instead of addressing his arguments. This is how institutional gatekeeping works. You don't need a grand conspiracy. You just need a system that rewards conformity and punishes deviation. You need funding agencies that only grant money for research aligned with established paradigms. You need journals that only publish papers supporting conventional timelines. You need universities that only grant tenure to professors who don't rock the boat. And you need a few high-profile examples of what happens to people who challenge the system, people like Schoch and Hancock, to keep everyone else in line. Now let's talk about what they won't excavate. The Egyptian government restricts access to archaeological sites with incredible strictness. Want to do ground-penetrating radar at Giza? Denied. Want to take core samples from the Sphinx to carbon date the limestone? Denied. Want to explore the sealed chambers that we know exist beneath the Sphinx and inside the Great Pyramid? Denied. Why? The official explanation is preservation. These are precious monuments that need to be protected from damage. And that's partly true. Tourism and amateur archaeology have caused real harm to ancient sites. But there's also a pattern of denying research that might challenge established dates or reveal unexpected information. In the 1990s, researchers using ground-penetrating radar found evidence of chambers and tunnels beneath the Sphinx. The Egyptian government shut down further investigation. The chambers remain unexplored. Inside the Great Pyramid, there are narrow shafts leading from the king's and queen's chambers. In 2011, a robot was sent up one of these shafts and discovered a sealed door with copper handles. Behind that door was another sealed door. What's behind the second door? We don't know. The Egyptian government hasn't authorized further exploration. There are hieroglyphic inscriptions in areas of the Great Pyramid that tourists never see, areas sealed off by the authorities. What do those inscriptions say? We don't know. Egyptologists who've seen them won't discuss them publicly. Why seal off areas of the pyramid? Why refuse to explore chambers beneath the Sphinx? If these are just tombs built by 4th dynasty pharaohs, what's the harm in investigating? Unless they might reveal something that contradicts the official history. The Bosnian pyramid controversy is another telling example. In 2005, researchers in Bosnia announced the discovery of what appeared to be massive pyramid structures covered by soil and vegetation. The largest, the so-called Pyramid of the Sun, would be taller than the Great Pyramid of Giza if it's actually a pyramid. Initial investigations found concrete-like material, precisely cut stone blocks, and geometric tunnel systems beneath the structure. The tunnel walls showed tool marks. There were carved stone spheres. Radiocarbon dating of organic material in the concrete suggested it was at least 25,000 years old. The response from mainstream archaeology was immediate dismissal. They called it a natural formation. They said the tunnel systems were medieval mines. They refused to conduct detailed investigations. UNESCO sent a delegation that spent less than 3 hours on site before declaring there were no pyramids. But here's the thing, if it's just a natural hill, what's the harm in excavating it properly? Why not allow full archaeological investigation to settle the question definitively? If it's natural, the evidence will show that. If it's artificial, we've made an incredible discovery. The refusal to investigate suggests they're afraid of what they might find. Antarctica is perhaps the ultimate example of deliberately avoiding investigation. We know from ice core samples that Antarctica had periods of ice-free coastline. We know from maps like the Piri Reis map that someone mapped that coastline. We know from geological evidence that there were warmer periods when parts of Antarctica could have supported human habitation. And we've done almost no archaeological exploration there. Yes, the ice makes it difficult. Yes, it's expensive and logistically challenging. But we've sent robots to Mars. We've mapped the ocean floor. We've drilled through miles of ice in Greenland and Antarctica to extract climate data. We could absolutely conduct archaeological surveys in coastal areas and beneath the ice if we wanted to. We don't, because if we found evidence of pre-Ice Age human presence in Antarctica, it would mean humans had transoceanic navigation capability at least 12,000 years ago, probably much earlier. It would mean there was global civilization before the Ice Age. It would mean rewriting everything, so we don't look. The ocean floors are 95% unexplored. We've mapped them with sonar, but detailed exploration is rare. And when underwater structures are found like the formations off Yonaguni, Dwarka, and Cuba, they're explained away as natural formations without thorough investigation. Why not explore them properly? Why not excavate them? Why not use the same archaeological techniques we use on land sites to determine if they're natural or artificial? We have the technology. We have underwater archaeology programs at universities. We have funding for ocean exploration, but we don't investigate underwater structures that might be 12,000 years old because they're not supposed to exist. And if they don't exist, why waste resources proving it? This is how the cover-up works. It's not men in black suits threatening researchers. It's institutional funding decisions. It's peer review gatekeeping. It's permit denials. It's career consequences for asking the wrong questions. It's the silent agreement that some lines of inquiry are off limits. And the result is that we have a timeline that doesn't fit the evidence. We're told civilization began 6,000 years ago, but we have megalithic sites, 11,600 years old. We're told ancient peoples were primitive, but we have evidence of astronomical computers, advanced metallurgy, and precision stone cutting we can barely replicate. We're told the flood myths are just stories, but we have geological evidence of catastrophic flooding exactly when the myths say it happened. The cognitive dissonance is staggering, and rather than address it, the establishment simply ignores the evidence that doesn't fit. Every few years, a new discovery forces a small revision. Gobekli Tepe pushed the timeline back for monumental architecture. Genetic studies confirmed population bottlenecks. Climate research acknowledged the Younger Dryas impact hypothesis has merit. Bit by bit, the conventional timeline is being forced to adjust. But the core resistance remains. The idea of advanced pre-Ice Age civilization is still considered fringe. Researchers who pursue it are still marginalized. Evidence that supports it is still dismissed without proper investigation. And that raises an uncomfortable question. Are we avoiding this evidence because it contradicts our timeline? Or because it suggests something even more disturbing, that civilization is cyclical, that we've risen and fallen before, and that we might not be as special or as permanent as we'd like to believe? Maybe the cover-up isn't about hiding the past. Maybe it's about hiding the future. Because if it happened before, it can happen again. And if we acknowledge that, we have to face the possibility that our current civilization is just as vulnerable as the one that drowned 12,000 years ago. We'd rather not think about that. So we don't look, we don't ask, we don't investigate. We just keep teaching the comfortable timeline where humanity steadily progressed from primitive to advanced, where we're at the pinnacle of achievement, where nothing like this has happened before, and nothing like this could happen again. And we hope that if we ignore the evidence long enough, it will stop contradicting us. When the waters finally receded and the skies cleared, the survivors emerged from their mountain refuges into a world transformed. The coastlines they had known were gone, drowned beneath hundreds of feet of risen ocean. The cities were submerged. The monuments were buried. Most of the population was dead. But they weren't starting from zero. They had memories, they had knowledge, and they had a mission to rebuild what had been lost and to make sure future generations would remember what happened. Gobekli Tepe might be the first monument they built. Think about the timeline. The Younger Dryas impact occurred around 12,800 years ago. Gobekli Tepe was constructed around 11,600 years ago, roughly 1,200 years after the catastrophe. That's enough time for a population to partially recover, to shift from pure survival mode to having the surplus resources necessary for monumental construction. But here's what's fascinating. Gobekli Tepe wasn't built as a city. There's no evidence of permanent habitation, no houses, no trash heaps, no signs that people lived there. It was built purely as a ceremonial center, a memorial, a place to gather and remember. And what does it memorialize? Pillar 43, the vulture stone, appears to record the exact astronomical configuration of the sky on the night of the impact. It's not just decoration, it's a date stamp. It's saying, this is when it happened, this is what we witnessed. Do not forget. Then they buried it, intentionally filled in the entire complex with thousands of tons of debris. Why? Perhaps they knew another catastrophe was coming. Perhaps they wanted to preserve the memorial for future generations who would have the technology to excavate it. Perhaps burial was the only way to ensure it survived. Whatever their reasoning, it worked. Gobekli Tepe sat undisturbed for 11,600 years until we finally found it and began to understand its message. But Gobekli Tepe wasn't the only place the survivors gathered. Around the world, in the centuries after the flood, monumental construction begins appearing, and it appears suddenly, without the gradual development you'd expect if people were figuring things out from scratch. Egyptian civilization doesn't slowly evolve. It appears fully formed around 5,000 years ago, with sophisticated hieroglyphic writing, advanced mathematics, precise astronomy, monumental architecture, and complex social organization already in place. The first dynasty shows the same level of sophistication as later dynasties. There's no learning curve. It's as if they already knew how to do everything, because they did. They were working from inherited knowledge. The mystery schools, the priesthoods, the architectural traditions, these weren't innovations. They were reconstructions of older knowledge preserved through the dark centuries after the flood. The Egyptian texts refer to Zep Tepe, the first time, when gods walked among men and built the original monuments. Mainstream Egyptology dismisses this as mythology. But what if it's historical memory? What if the gods were the survivors of the pre-flood civilization, the ones who still remembered the old knowledge and tried to pass it on? The same pattern appears in Sumer. Sumerian civilization appears around 6,000 years ago with cuneiform writing, advanced mathematics, astronomy, irrigation systems, and urban planning already developed. The Sumerians themselves claimed their knowledge came from the Apkallu, 7 wise beings, who emerged from the sea after a great flood and taught humanity the arts of civilization. Again, this is dismissed as mythology. But it's the same story. After the flood, knowledgeable survivors emerge and teach the arts of civilization to the scattered, struggling remnants of humanity. In the Indus Valley, sophisticated urban civilization appears around 5,000 years ago at sites like Mohenjo-Daro and Harappa. Advanced city planning, standardized weights and measures, sophisticated plumbing and drainage systems all appearing without apparent precedent. In China, advanced civilization appears along the Yellow River around 5,000 years ago, with sophisticated bronze working, writing, and social organization. In Mesoamerica, the Olmec civilization appears around 3,500 years ago, with monumental stone heads, advanced astronomy, and a calendar system that rivals anything developed in the Old World. Notice the pattern. Around the world, at different times, advanced civilizations appear suddenly with sophisticated knowledge systems already in place. The standard explanation is that these represent independent invention, that humans in different parts of the world all figured out civilization separately. But there's another explanation. These are all inheritor civilizations. They're all building on fragments of knowledge preserved from before the flood. The knowledge was global originally, but after the catastrophe, different survivor groups preserved different pieces. As populations recovered and grew, they rebuilt using whatever knowledge their particular group had managed to preserve. That would explain why megalithic construction techniques appear globally, why astronomical knowledge appears in cultures with no contact, why mathematical constants like pi and phi show up in monuments on different continents. Not because different peoples independently discovered the same things, but because they were all working from the same original knowledge base. preserved through different transmission chains. The myths support this interpretation. The flood myths aren't just about destruction, they're about preservation and transmission. In the Mesopotamian account, Utnapishtim is specifically told to bring craftsmen onto the boat, people with knowledge and skills necessary to rebuild civilization. It's not just about saving lives, it's about saving knowledge. The biblical Noah is told to bring his sons, who represent different trades and skills. The animals aren't just for repopulation, they're agricultural stock, the foundation of civilization. In the Hindu version, Manu is told to save seeds of all plants, not just food crops, but all plants. The preservation of biodiversity and agricultural knowledge. The Greek account has Deucalion and Pyrrha repopulating the earth by throwing stones that transform into people, which might be a metaphor for teaching scattered survivors how to rebuild society, transforming stones, primitive survivors, into people, civilized humans. These myths are describing a conscious effort to preserve knowledge through the catastrophe. And that knowledge preservation took multiple forms. The mystery schools were one form. These weren't just religious institutions. They were educational systems designed to preserve and transmit knowledge across generations, using techniques that could survive the loss of written records. The Egyptian mystery schools used initiation rituals to encode astronomical, mathematical, and philosophical knowledge in experiential form. You didn't just memorize facts, you underwent experiences that embedded the knowledge in multiple ways, making it more resilient to forgetting. The Eleusinian mysteries in Greece used similar techniques. Initiates underwent a transformative experience that conveyed profound knowledge about life, death, and cosmic cycles. The actual content was secret, protected by death penalty for anyone who revealed it. Why such extreme secrecy? Because the knowledge was considered too important to risk losing through casual transmission. The Hermetic tradition encoded knowledge in symbolic language. As above, so below isn't just philosophy, it's a compressed way of teaching correspondence between celestial mechanics and earthly processes. Understanding that principle unlocks vast amounts of astronomical and mathematical knowledge. The Vedic tradition in India used elaborate mnemonic techniques and precise oral transmission to preserve enormous amounts of information across millennia. The accuracy is remarkable. Modern recordings of Vedic chants match written versions created thousands of years ago almost perfectly. This wasn't casual storytelling. This was deliberate knowledge preservation, using human memory as the storage medium, because memory can't be burned like books or destroyed like monuments. The myths themselves were encoding devices. Stories are easier to remember than facts. Narratives stick in memory in ways that raw data doesn't. So the survivors encoded their knowledge in myth. The flood story preserves the knowledge that catastrophic climate change and sea level rise have happened before and can happen again. It preserves the knowledge that warning signs exist, changes in the sky, changes in animal behavior, changes in the environment. The Atlantis story preserves the knowledge that advanced civilizations have existed and been destroyed. It preserves the warning that technological advancement without wisdom leads to destruction. The stories about golden ages preserve the knowledge that humanity has achieved greater heights before and fallen. They preserve the understanding that progress isn't linear, that civilizations rise and fall in cycles. The dragon and serpent myths appear globally. Dragons are associated with wisdom, with hidden knowledge, with the guardians of treasures. What are they guarding? The knowledge from before the flood. The serpent in Eden that offers knowledge isn't necessarily evil in the original context. It's the preserver of forbidden truth that the authorities don't want people to know. The pyramid symbolism appears globally: Egypt, Mesoamerica, China, Southeast Asia. Why pyramids? Because they're geometrically stable structures that can survive earthquakes and time, because their shapes encode mathematical constants, because they serve as astronomical markers. The survivors built pyramids because they knew pyramids would last and could serve as teaching monuments for future generations. The astronomical alignments aren't coincidental. Stonehenge, the pyramids of Giza, Angkor Wat, Teotihuacan, all aligned to celestial events with precision that required sophisticated astronomical knowledge. These alignments serve multiple purposes. They function as calendars. They mark important celestial cycles like the precession of the equinoxes, and they prove to future generations that the builders possessed advanced knowledge. When you align a monument to true north with precision within 1/15 of a degree, you're not just building a tomb, you're leaving a message. You're saying, we knew, we understood geometry, astronomy, engineering. We were not primitive. Remember us. Remember what we knew. The Great Pyramid encodes mathematical constants pi and phi in its dimensions. The relationship between its height and base perimeter equals 2 times pi. The golden ratio appears in multiple aspects of its geometry. These aren't accidents. They're deliberate. The builders were encoding mathematical knowledge in stone, creating a monument that would teach future mathematicians that these constants were known and understood thousands of years before they were supposedly discovered. The precision stone cutting at sites like Sacsayhuaman, Puma, Punku, and the Egyptian temples wasn't just showing off. It was demonstrating capability. It was proving that advanced technology existed, even if the tools themselves were lost. The monuments remain as evidence that someone knew how to achieve this level of precision. The acoustic engineering in megalithic chambers wasn't just for ritual purposes. Sound can carry information. Resonance frequencies can affect consciousness. The survivors were preserving knowledge about acoustics, about the relationship between sound, structure, and human neurology. All of this, the monuments, the myths, the mystery schools, the encoded knowledge, represents a desperate effort by survivors to preserve what they could and pass it forward. They knew most of the knowledge would be lost. They knew they were facing a dark age, but they tried to preserve enough so that when civilization eventually recovered, their descendants would have clues. They would have starting points. They would have warnings. And they tried to warn us about the future. The cyclical nature of catastrophe appears in myths worldwide. The Hindu yugas describe cycles of rise and fall. The Hopi describe multiple previous worlds, each destroyed so that a new one could begin. The Mayan calendar marks vast cycles of time. The Egyptian texts speak of the sun completing its journey and beginning again. These aren't just philosophical concepts. They're astronomical observations. The precession of the equinoxes takes 25,800 years for a complete cycle. The Earth's orbit around the sun intersects debris streams from fragmenting comets on predictable cycles. Solar activity follows cycles. Magnetic pole reversals follow cycles. The ancients understood that catastrophe isn't random. It's cyclical. It happens, then it happens again, then it happens again. The interval between catastrophes might be thousands of years, but it's not infinite. It will come again, and we're approaching another cycle point. The Younger Dryas impact occurred 12,800 years ago. If catastrophic impacts follow roughly 12,000-year cycles, we're overdue. The torrid meteor stream that Earth passes through twice a year contains fragments large enough to cause devastation if they intersect our orbit at the wrong angle. We've had near misses. In 1908, the Tunguska event in Siberia was likely a small fragment from this stream that exploded in the atmosphere with the force of a nuclear weapon, flattening 2,000 square kilometers of forest. That was small. A larger fragment could trigger the same cascade the Younger Dryas impact did: atmospheric debris, impact winter, climate disruption. The Earth's magnetic field is weakening. It's been weakening for 2,000 years. Some scientists suggest we're approaching a magnetic pole reversal, which could temporarily reduce the magnetosphere's protection against cosmic radiation and solar events. Solar activity follows cycles. We're entering a period of increased solar activity. A massive solar flare, what's called a Carrington event, after the one that occurred in 1859, could knock out electrical grids worldwide, destroying transformers and satellites, sending technological civilization back to pre-industrial conditions in a matter of hours. The ancient warnings aren't abstract. They're specific. Watch the sky. Pay attention to cycles. Prepare for the possibility that what happened before will happen again. The survivors tried to tell us. They built monuments that would outlast languages and empires. They encoded warnings in myths that would be retold for thousands of years. They preserved knowledge in symbols that transcend cultural boundaries. We are their descendants. We carry their DNA. We walk among their monuments. We read their myths without understanding that they're history, not fantasy. And if we're not careful, if we don't pay attention to what they tried to teach us, we'll repeat their fate. We'll be the next civilization that rises high, grows arrogant, ignores the warnings, and gets blindsided by catastrophe. The difference is, we have something they didn't. We have their example. We know it's happened before. We know it can happen again. We have the technology to watch the skies, to track potential impacts, to prepare. The question is whether we'll listen to the warnings they left us, or whether we'll dismiss them as primitive superstition until it's too late. The legacy of the survivors isn't just monuments and myths. It's the warning itself, and that warning is still waiting for us to truly hear it. We started this journey with a simple question. What if everything we know is wrong? And after 2 hours of evidence, myths, monuments, and mysteries, the answer is clear. Not everything we know is wrong. But the story we've been told about human history, the neat, linear progression from primitive to advanced, the timeline that puts civilizations beginning at 6,000 years ago, the assumption that we're the first and only advanced human culture, that story is incomplete at best, and fundamentally flawed at worst. The evidence is overwhelming once you look at it with open eyes. Gobekli Tepe stands as proof that sophisticated construction and social organization existed 11,600 years ago. The underwater structures suggest coastal civilizations drowned by rising sea levels. The ancient maps prove someone charted the world, including Antarctica, long before we supposedly had the capability. The genetic bottleneck confirms that human population crashed to near extinction levels 12,000 years ago. The geological record shows cosmic impacts, catastrophic flooding, and rapid climate change at exactly the moment the flood myths describe. We're not making this up. We're not connecting dots that don't exist. The dots are there. The evidence is there. It's been there all along, waiting for us to stop dismissing it and start actually looking at what it's telling us. And what it's telling us is humbling. We are not the pinnacle of human achievement. We are not the first civilization to develop mathematics, astronomy, engineering, and philosophy. We're not the first to build monuments that encode knowledge. We're not the first to achieve sophistication and then face catastrophe. We're the inheritors. We're the descendants of survivors who lost almost everything but managed to preserve fragments. We stand on the shoulders of forgotten giants, people whose names we'll never know, whose cities are drowned beneath the oceans, whose monuments are buried beneath the sands, but whose knowledge survived just enough to give us a foundation to rebuild upon. That's not a comfortable realization. We like to think of ourselves as special, as unique, as the triumphant endpoint of evolutionary and cultural progress. But history isn't linear. It's cyclical. Civilizations rise and fall. Knowledge is gained and lost. Humanity reaches heights and then gets knocked back down by forces beyond our control. Cosmic impacts, climate catastrophe, our own hubris. But here's why that's okay. Here's why accepting that our history is incomplete and that we've risen and fallen before isn't cause for despair. It means we have potential we haven't even recognized yet. If our ancestors 12,000 years ago could achieve what the evidence suggests, global navigation, sophisticated astronomy, advanced engineering, knowledge systems that rival our own, then we carry that potential in our DNA and our cultural memory. We're not starting from scratch. We're rediscovering what was always within us. It means the knowledge we think is modern might be much older. The mathematics we attribute to the Greeks might come from sources far more ancient. The astronomy we credit to Renaissance Europe might be rediscovered wisdom from before the flood. We're not inventing, we're remembering. And it means we have warnings, we have examples. We know what can happen when civilization grows too confident, too disconnected from natural cycles, too certain of its own permanence. We know what cosmic catastrophes look like. We know the warning signs. We know that it's happened before and can happen again. That knowledge is power. It's the difference between being blindsided and being prepared. It's the difference between losing everything like our ancestors did and potentially having the wisdom and technology to survive what they could not. The survivors who built Gobekli Tepe and encoded their warnings in myths weren't just looking backward in grief. They were looking forward in hope. They were saying, "We failed. We weren't ready. But you can be. Learn from us. Remember what happened. Don't make our mistakes." The truth is still being written. The archaeological record is incomplete. 95% of the ocean floor remains unexplored. Antarctica's secrets remain locked under ice. Countless sites remain unexcavated. The story of who we were and who we can be is still unfolding. And that's the real legacy of the lost era before the flood. Not just monuments and myths, but possibility. The possibility that we're more than we've been told. The possibility that our ancestors were greater than we imagined. The possibility that the future doesn't have to repeat the catastrophes of the past if we're willing to listen to the warnings encoded in stone and story. Join Mr. H in uncovering what they forgot to teach us. Subscribe for more forbidden history, because this journey isn't over. It's just beginning. Let's return for a moment to where we started. To the old man carving symbols into wet clay as the sky cracked open above him. To the survivor on the mountaintop watching the flood recede, seeing a world transformed, knowing everything he had known was gone, but also knowing something else. Knowing that he survived. Knowing that others survived. Knowing that the sun was rising on a new world. A world that would need to be rebuilt, A world that would need to remember. He carved his tablet. He told his children told theirs. The story survived for 12,000 years, until we finally found the tablet, decoded the symbols, and began to understand. His world ended. But the story didn't. Our world will face its own challenges, its own catastrophes, its own moments when everything seems lost. But the story will continue, because that's what humans do. We survive. We remember. We rebuild. We rise again. Sleep well, knowing the truth is still being written, and we are the ones writing it.